Tonight I'm trying some classics from a few literary giants for you. It's a little different than some of the works I usually present, but we hope you enjoy it. First up is Hemingway's The Killers, written in the 1920s when organized crime was at its peak during Prohibition. Chicago was the home of Al Capone, and Hemingway himself spent time in Chicago as a young man. When things became too dangerous for the mob, they retreated to the suburb of Summit, where The Killers, tonight's story, takes place. Now, not long before this story was written, the Chicago mob had killed a popular boxer of the time, Andre Anderson, who once knocked Jack Dempsey off his feet. And Andre Anderson is likely Hemingway's source for the Swede in this story. The writer's depiction of this human experience, his use of satire, the everlasting themes of death and friendship and the purpose of life have contributed to make The Killers one of Hemingway's most famous stories. The story features one Nick Adams, a famous Hemingway character from his short stories. In the night stories, Hemingway shows Adams crossing over from teenager to adult. The basic plot of the story involves a pair of criminals who enter a restaurant seeking to kill a boxer, a Swede named Ole Anderson, who's hiding out for reasons unknown, possibly for winning a fight. Why am I telling you all this? Because it's kind of interesting about why these stories are made and why they're representative of these authors. This story is in the, they call the minimalist style. The basic characteristics of minimalism are ordinary subject matter, passive, as they say, an effectless protagonist, very little plot, and spare, emotionally restrained writing style. There's nothing really extraordinary about the story. It's plain sense, it's just a simple story. There's hardly any plot, there's virtually no character development, and very little description of the setting in the story. That sounds exciting, doesn't it? Hemingway's minimalistic approach, like in this story, greatly influenced American writing. So that's why we chose this one for a representative of Ernest Hemingway. That and I couldn't fit the old man in the sea in an hour. Okay then, The Killers by Ernest Papa Hemingway. Oh, I've edited one word in this story, one word that appeared 12 times. You'll probably be able to pick it out. The door of Henry's lunchroom opened and two men came in. They sat down at the counter. "What's yours?" George asked them. "I don't know," one of the men said. "What do you want to eat, Al?" "I don't know," said Al. "I don't know what I want to eat." Outside, it was getting dark. The street light came on outside the window. The two men at the counter read the menu. From the other end of the counter, Nick Adams watched them. He'd been talking to George when they came in. Yeah, I'll have a roast pork tenderloin with applesauce and mashed potatoes," the first man said. "It isn't ready yet." "Well, what the hell do you put it on the card for, then?" "That's the dinner," George explained. "You can get that at 6 o'clock, all right?" George looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter. "It's 5 o'clock. "The clock says 20 minutes past 5, the second man said. "It's 20 minutes fast." "Oh, hell with the clock. What have you got to eat, anyway?" "I give you any kind of sandwiches," said George. "You can have ham and eggs and bacon and eggs, or liver and bacon, or a steak." "Eh, give me chicken croquettes with green peas and a cream sauce and mashed potatoes, right?" "That's the dinner." "Everything we want's the dinner, eh? That's the way you work it?" "I can give you ham and eggs, bacon and eggs, liver." Yeah, all right. "I'll take ham and eggs," the man called Al said. He wore a derby hat and a black overcoat buttoned across the chest. His face was small and white. He had tight lips. He wore a silk muffler and gloves. "Yeah, give me bacon and eggs," said the other man. He was about the same size as Al. Their faces were different, but they were dressed like twins. Both wore overcoats too tight for them. They sat leaning forward, their elbows on the counter. "You got anything to drink?" Al asked. "Silver beer, bevo, ginger ale," said George. Bevo. Don't want to reveal my own age, but most of you are probably too young to know what bevo is. Anybody? It's from the Prohibition times. It's kind of like near beer. It's a malt beverage, but non-alcoholic. Bevo. Yeah, what's the point? Yeah, we got silver beer, bevo, ginger ale. "I mean, you got anything to drink?" "Just those I said." "Yeah, this is a hot town. What do they call it?" "Summit." "You ever hear of that?" Al asked his friend. "No," said the friend. What do you do here nights? Al asked. They eat dinner, his friend said. They all come here and they eat the big dinner. That's right, George said. So you think that's right? Al asked George. Sure. Yeah, you're a pretty bright boy, aren't you? Sure, said George. Well, you're not, said the other little man. Is he, Al? Nah, he's dumb, said Al. He turned to Nick. What's your name? Adams. Yeah, another bright boy, Al said. Ain't he the bright boy, Max? Yeah, this town's just full of bright boys, Max said. George put down 2 platters, one of ham and eggs, the other of bacon and eggs on the counter. He set down 2 side dishes of fried potatoes. He closed the wicket into the kitchen. Which is yours? He asked Al. Well, don't you remember? Your ham and eggs. Yeah, just a bright boy, Max said. He leaned forward. He took the ham and eggs. Both men ate with their gloves on. George watched them eat. What are you looking at? Max looked at George. Nothing. The hell you were. You were just looking at me. Yeah, maybe the boy meant it for a joke, Max, Al said. George laughed. You don't have to laugh, Max said to him. You don't have to laugh at all, see? All right, said George. So he thinks it's all right, Max turned on. He thinks it's all right. That's a good one. Oh, yeah, he's a thinker, Al said. They went on eating. What's the bright boy's name down the counter there? Al asked Max. Hey, bright boy, Max said to Nick. You go around on the other side of the counter with your boyfriend. Yeah, what's the idea? Nick said. You better go around, bright boy, Al said. Nick went around behind the counter. What's the idea? George asked. None of your damn business, Al said. Who's out in the kitchen? Yeah, the dummy. What do you mean the dummy? You know, the dummy that cooks. Tell him to come in. What's the idea? Tell him to come in here. What do you think you are? We know damn well we are, the man called Max said. Do we look silly? You talk silly, Al said to him. What the hell do you argue with this kid for? Listen, he said to George. Tell that dummy to come out here. What are you going to do with him? Nothing. Use your head, bright boy. What will we do to a dummy? George opened the slip that opened back into the kitchen. Sam, come in here a minute. The door of the kitchen opened and Sam, the dummy, came in. Yeah, what was it? He asked. The 10 men at the counter took a look at him. All right, dummy. You stand there. You stand right there, Al said. Sam, standing in his apron, looked at the 2 men sitting at the counter. Yes, sir. Al got down from his stool. I'm going back to the kitchen with the dummy and the bright boy. You go back to the kitchen, dummy. You go in there with him, bright boy. Little man walked after Nick and Sam, the cook, back into the kitchen. The door shut after them. The man called Max out of the counter opposite George. He didn't look at George, but he looked in the mirror that ran along the back of the counter. Henry's had been made over from a saloon into a lunch counter, see. Well, bright boy, Max said, looking in the mirror, why don't you say something? What's it all about? Hey, Al, Max called. Bright boy here wants to know what this is all about, eh? Well, why don't you tell him? Al's voice came from the kitchen. What do you think it's all about? Well, I don't know. What do you think? Max looked in the mirror all the time he was talking. I wouldn't say. Hey, Al, right boy says he wouldn't say what he thinks it's all about. I can hear you all right, Al said from the kitchen. He propped open the slit that the dishes passed through into the kitchen with a ketchup bottle. Listen, bright boy, he said from the kitchen to George. Stand a little further along the bar. You move a little to the left, Max. It was like a photographer arranging for a group picture. You talk to me, bright boy, Max said. What do you think's going to happen? George did not say anything. I'll tell you, Max said. We're going to kill a Swede. Do you know a big Swede named Ole Anderson? Yes. He comes in to eat every night, doesn't he? Sometimes he comes here. He comes here at 6 o'clock, doesn't he? If he comes, yeah. We know all that, bright boy, Max said. Talk about something else. Ever go to the movies? Yeah, once in a while. You ought to go to the movies more. The movies are fine for a bright boy like you. What are you going to kill old Anderson for? What he ever done to you? Heh, he never had a chance to do nothing to us. He never even seen us. And he's only going to kill him. And he's only going to kill him for then, George asked. Well, kill him for a friend. Just to oblige a friend, bright boy. Shut up, said Al from the kitchen. You talk too much. Well, I gotta keep Bright Boy here amused. Don't I, Bright Boy? You talk too damn much, Al said. The dummy and my Bright Boy are amused by themselves. I got them tied up like a couple of girlfriends in the convent. Yeah, suppose you were in a convent? Yeah, you never know. You were in a kosher convent. That's what you was. George looked up at the clock. If anybody comes in, you tell them the cook is off. If they keep after you, tell them you go back and cook yourself. Do you get that, Bright Boy? Eh? All right, George said. What are you going to do with us afterwards? Yeah, that'll depend. That's one of those things you never know at the time. You know what I mean? George looked up at the clock. It was 6:15 now. The door from the street opened. A street motorman named Orlando came in. Hello, George. Can I get supper? Yeah, Sam's gone out, George said. He'll be back in about half an hour. I better go up the street then, the motorman said. George looked at the clock. It was 20 minutes past 6. That was nice, Bright Boy. Yeah, Max said. You're a regular little gentleman, ain't you? Yeah, he knew I'd blow Orlando's head off if he told him, Al said from the kitchen. No, said Max, it ain't that. Bright Boy is nice. He's a nice boy. I like him. At 6:55, George said. Yeah, he's not coming. 2 other people had been in the lunchroom. Once George had gone out to the kitchen and made a ham and egg sandwich to go that a man wanted to take with him. Inside the kitchen, he saw Al, his derby hat tilted back, sitting on a stool beside the wicket with the muzzle of a sawed-off shotgun resting on the ledge. Nick and the cook were back-to-back in the corner, a towel tied in each of their mouths. George had cooked the sandwich, wrapped it up in oiled paper, put it in a bag, brought it in, and the man had paid for it and gone out. Hey, Bright Boy can do everything, Max said. He can cook and everything. You'd make some girl a nice wife there, Bright Boy. Yes, George said. Your friend, old Anderson, isn't going to come. Yeah. We'll give him 10 more minutes, Max said. Max watched the mirror in the clock. The hands of the clock marked 7 o'clock and then 5 minutes past 7. Come on, Al, Max said. We better go. He's not coming. Yeah, you better give him 5 minutes, Al said from the kitchen. In the 5 minutes, a man came in. George explained the cook was sick. Why the hell don't you get another cook? The man asked. Aren't you running a lunch counter or what? He went out. Come on, Al, Max said. What about the 2 Bright Boys, the dummy? They're all right. You think so? Sure, we're through with it. I don't like it, said Al. It's sloppy. You talk too much. Oh, what the hell, said Max. We got to keep amused, haven't we? You talk too much all the damn time, Al said. He came out from the kitchen. The cut-off barrels of the shotgun made a slight bulge under the waist of his too tight-fitting overcoat. He straightened his coat with his gloved hands. So long, Bright Boy, he said to George. You got a lot of luck. That's the truth, Max said. You ought to play the race there, Bright Boy. 2 of them went out the door. George watched them through the window, passed under the arc light and crossed the street. In their overcoats and derby hats, they looked like a vaudeville team. George went back through the swinging door into the kitchen and untied Nick and the cook. I don't want any more of that, said Sam, the cook. I don't want any more of that. Nick stood up. He'd never had a towel in his mouth before. Say, he said. What the hell? He was trying to swagger it off. They were going to kill old Anderson, George said. They were going to shoot him when he came in to eat. Old Anderson? Sure. The cook felt the corners of his mouth with his thumbs. Were they all gone? Yeah, said George. They're gone now. I don't like it, said the cook. I don't like any of it at all. Listen, George said to Nick. You better go see old Anderson. Yeah, all right. You better not have anything to do with it at all, Sam, the cook said. You better stay away at all, Sam, the cook said. You better stay way out of it at all. Yeah, don't go if you don't want to, George said. Mix it up and this ain't gonna get you anywhere, the cook said. You stay out of it here? Yeah, I'll go see him, Nick said to George. Where does he live? The cook turned away. Little boys always know what they want to do, he said. He lives up the Hirsch's rooming house, George said to Nick. Yeah, I'll go up there. Outside, the arc light shone through the bare branches of a tree. Nick walked up the street beside the car tracks, turned at the next arc light down a side street. 3 houses up the street was Hirsch's rooming house. Nick walked up the 2 steps and pushed the bell. A woman came to the door. Yeah, is old Anderson here? Do you want to see him? Yeah, if he's in. Nick followed the woman up a flight of stairs back to the end of the corridor. She knocked on the door. Who is it? It's Nick Adams. Yeah, come in. Nick opened the door and went into the room. Old Anderson was lying on the bed with all his clothes on. Old Anderson had been a heavyweight prize fighter. He was too long for that bed. He lay with his head on 2 pillows. He did not look at Nick. Yeah, what was it? Yeah, well, Nick says, I was up at Henry's and 2 fellas come in and tied up me and the cook, and they said they were going to kill you. Sounded silly when he said it out loud. Old Anderson said nothing. Yeah, well, Nick went on. They put us out in the kitchen. They were going to shoot you when you came in to supper. Old Anderson looked at the wall and did not say anything. Yeah, well, George, he thought I'd better come and tell you about it. Well, there isn't anything you can do about it, Old Anderson said. I'll tell you what they look like, what they were like, yeah. I don't want to know what they were like, Old Anderson said. He looked at the wall. Thanks for coming to tell me about it. Yeah, that's all right. Nick looked at the big man lying on the bed. Don't you want me to go and see the police? No, Old Anderson said. That wouldn't do any good. Isn't there something I could do for you? No, there ain't anything to do. Maybe it was just a bluff. No, it ain't just a bluff. Old Anderson rolled over towards the wall. The only thing is, he said, talking towards the wall, I just can't make up my mind to go out. I've been in here all day, see? Couldn't you get out of town or what? No, Old Anderson said. I'm through with all that running around. He looked at the wall. There ain't nothing to do now. Could you just fix it up some way or what? No, I got in wrong. He talked in the same flat voice. There ain't anything to do. After a while, I'll make up my mind to go out, see? Yeah, well, I better go back and see George, Nick said. So long, said Old Anderson. He did not look towards Nick. Thanks for coming round anyways. Nick went out. As he shut the door, he saw Old Anderson with all his clothes on, lying on the bed and looking at the wall. He's been in his room all day, the landlady said downstairs. I guess he don't feel well. I said to him, Mr. Anderson, you ought to go out and take a walk on a nice fall day like this. But he says he didn't feel like it, you know. And he doesn't want to go out. Yeah, well, I'm sorry he don't feel well, the woman said. He's an awfully nice man, Mr. Anderson is. He was in the ring, you know. I know it. You never knew it, expect from the way his face is, you know. The woman and he stood talking just inside the door. He's just as gentle. Yeah, well, good night, Mrs. Hirsch, Nick said. Oh, I'm not Mrs. Hirsch. She owns the place. I just look after her. I'm Mrs. Bell. Well, good night, Mrs. Bell, Nick said. Yeah, good night to you. Nick walked up the Stark Street to the corner of the arc light and then along the car tracks to Henry's eating house. George was inside, back at the counter. So what, did you see Ole? Yeah, said Nick. He's in his room and he won't go out. The cook opened the door from the kitchen when he heard Nick's voice. I don't even listen to it, he said and shut the door. Did you tell him about it or what? George asked. Yeah, sure. I told him about it, but he knows what it's all about. What's he going to do? Nothing. They'll kill him. Yeah, I guess they will. Oh, he must have got mixed up with something in Chicago. Yeah, I guess so, said Nick. It's a hell of a thing. It's an awful thing, Nick said. They did not say anything. George reached down for a towel and wiped the counter. Hey, I wonder what he did, Nick said. Yeah, he double-crossed somebody. That's what they kill him for. I'm going to get out of this town, Nick said. Yeah, said George, that's a good thing to do. I can't stand to think about him waiting in the room knowing he's going to get it. It's too damned awful. Well, said George, you best not think about it then. And so that's an example of the minimalist style from Ernest Hemingway. And a very popular and often anthologized story by Ernest Hemingway at that. We got 2 more stories. Next up is God Sees the Truth But Waits by Russian author Leo Tolstoy. First published in 1870-something, 1872, I think. The story about a man sent to prison for a murder he didn't commit takes the form of a parable of forgiveness. The concept of the story of a man wrongfully accused of murder and banished to Siberia also appears in Tolstoy's much larger work, War and Peace, during a philosophical discussion between two characters who relate the story and argue how the protagonist of their story deals with injustice and fate. In the town of Vladimir lived a young merchant named Ivan Dmitritch Aksionov. He had 2 shops and a house of his own. Aksionov was a handsome, fair-haired, curly-headed fellow, full of fun, very fond of singing. When quite a young man, he had been given to drink and was riotous when he had had too much, but after he married, he gave up drinking, well, except now and then. One summer, Aksionov was going to the Nizhny Fair, and as he bade goodbye to his family, his wife said to him, "Ivan Dmitritch, do not start today. I have had a bad dream about you." Aksionov laughed and said, "You are afraid that when I go to the fair I shall go on a spree." His wife replied, "I do not know what I am afraid of. All I know is that I had a bad dream. I dreamt you returned from the town, and when you took off your cap I saw that your hair was quite grey." Aksionov laughed. "That's a lucky sign," he said. "See if I don't sell out all my goods and bring you some presents from the fair." And so Aksionov said goodbye to his family and drove away. When he traveled halfway, he met a merchant whom he knew, and they put up at the same inn for the night. They had some tea together and then went to bed in adjoining rooms. It was not Aksionov's habit to sleep late, and wishing to travel while it was still cool, he aroused his driver before dawn and told him to put in the horses. Then he made his way across to the landlord of the inn, who lived in a cottage at the back. He paid his bill and continued on his journey. When he had gone about 25 miles, he stopped for the horses to be fed. Aksionov rested a while in the passages of the inn, and then he stepped out into the porch, and ordering a samovar to be heated, he got out his guitar and began to play. Suddenly a troika came up with tinkling bells, and an official alighted, followed by 2 soldiers. He came in to Aksionov and began to question him, asking him who he was and whence he came. Aksionov answered him fully and said, "Won't you have some tea with me?" But the official went on cross-questioning him and asking him, "Where did you spend the night? Were you alone or with a fellow merchant? Did you see the other merchant this morning? Why did you leave the inn before dawn?" Aksionov wondered why he was asked all these questions, but he described all that had happened and added, "Why do you cross-question me as if I were a thief or a robber? I am traveling on business of my own. There is no need to question me." Then the official, calling the soldier, said, "I am the police officer of this district, and I question you because the merchant with whom you spent last night has been found with his throat cut. We must search your things." They entered the house. The soldiers and the police officer unstrapped Aksionov's luggage and searched it. Suddenly the officer drew a knife out of a bag, crying, "Whose knife is this?" Aksionov looked, and seeing a blood-stained knife taken from his bag, he was frightened. How is it that there's blood on this knife?" Aksionov tried to answer, but could hardly utter a word, and only stammered, I don't know. Not mine." Then the police officer said, "This morning the merchant was found in bed with his throat cut. You are the only person who could have done it. The house was locked from inside. No one else was there. Here is this blood-stained knife in your bag, and your face and manner betray you. Tell me how you killed him, and how much money you stole." Aksionov swore he had not done it, that he had not seen the merchant after they had had tea together, that he had had no money except 8,000 rubles of his own, and that the knife was not his. But his voice was broken, his face pale, and he trembled with fear, as though he were guilty. The police officer ordered the soldiers to bind Aksionov to put him in the cart. As they tied his feet together and flung him into the cart, Aksionov crossed himself and wept. His money and goods were taken from him, and he was sent to the nearest town and imprisoned there. Inquiries as to his character were made in Vladimir. The merchants and the other inhabitants of that town said that in former days Aksionov used to drink and waste his time, but that he was a good man. Then the trial came on. Aksionov was charged with murdering a merchant from Ryazan and robbing him of 20,000 rubles. Aksionov's wife was in despair and did not know what to believe. Her children were all quite small. One was a baby at her breast. Taking them all with her, she went into the town where her husband was in jail. At first she was not allowed to see him, but after much begging she obtained permission from the officials and was taken to him. When she saw her husband in prison dress and in chains, shut up with thieves and criminals, she fell down and did not come to her senses for a long time. Then she drew her children to her and sat down near him. She told him of things at home and asked about what had happened to him. He told her all, and she asked, What can we do now? We must petition the Tsar not to let an innocent man perish. His wife told him that she had sent a petition to the Tsar, but that it had not been accepted. Aksionov did not reply, but only looked downcast. Then his wife said, It was not for nothing I dreamt your hair had turned gray. You remember? You should not have started that day. And passing her fingers through his hair, she said, Vanya, dearest, tell your wife the truth. Was it not you who did it? Ha! So you too suspect me, said Aksionov, and hiding his face in his hands, he began to weep. Then a soldier came to say that the wife and children must go away, and Aksionov said goodbye to his family for the last time. When they were gone, Aksionov recalled what had been said, and we remember that his wife also had suspected him. He said to himself, It seems that only God can know the truth, and it is to him alone we must appeal, and from him alone expect mercy. And Aksionov wrote no more petitions, gave up all hope, and only prayed to God. Aksionov was condemned to be flogged and sent to the mines, and so he was flogged with a knot, and when the wounds made by the knot were healed, he was driven to Siberia with other convicts. For 26 years, Aksionov lived as a convict in Siberia. His hair turned white as snow. His beard grew long, thin, and gray. All his mirth went away. He stooped. He walked slowly, spoke little, never laughed, but he often prayed. In prison, Aksionov learned to make boots and earned a little money, with which he bought the lives of the saints. He read this book when there was light enough in the prison, and on Sundays in the prison church he read the lessons. He sang in the choir, for his voice was still good. The prison authorities liked Aksionov for his meekness, and his fellow prisoners respected him. They called him grandfather and the saint. When they wanted to petition the prison authorities about anything, they always made Aksionov their spokesman, and when there were quarrels among the prisoners, they came to him to put things right and to judge the matter. No news reached Aksionov from his home. He did not even know if his wife and children were still alive. And then one day, a fresh gang of convicts came to that prison. In the evening, the old prisoners collected around the new ones and asked them what towns or villages they came from, what they were sentenced for. Among the rest, Aksionov sat down near the newcomers and listened with downcast air to what was said. And one of the new convicts, a tall, strong man of 60, with a closely cropped gray beard, was telling the others what he had been arrested for. Well, my friends, I only took a horse that was tied to a sledge, and I was arrested and accused of stealing. I said I only taken it to get home quicker and then let it go. Besides, the driver was a personal friend of mine, so I said it's all right. No, they said, you stole it. But how or where I stole it, they could not say. I once really did something wrong, though. Yeah, something really wrong I once did. And ought by rights to come here long ago, me. But that time I was not found out. Now I've been sent here for nothing at all, But it's lies, I'm telling you. I've been to Siberia before, but I did not stay long. Where are you from? Asked someone. I'm from Vladimir. My family are of that town. My name is Makar, and they also call me Semyonik. Aksionov raised his head and said, Tell me, Semyonik, do you know anything of the merchants of Aksionov of Vladimir? Are they still alive? I know them. Of course I do. The Aksionovs are rich, though their father is in Siberia. A sinner like ourselves, it seems, old Granddad. Yeah, Granddad. Tell me, Granddad, how'd you come here? Aksionov did not like to speak of his misfortune. He only sighed and said, For my sins I have been in prison these 26 years. You? What sins? Asked Makar Semyonik. But Aksionov only said, Well, I must have deserved it. He would have said no more, But his companions told the newcomers how Aksionov came to be in Siberia, how someone had killed a merchant and had put the knife among Aksionov's things, and that Aksionov had been unjustly condemned to this prison. But Makar Semyonich heard this. He looked at Aksionov, he slapped his own knee and exclaimed,
"Ha, ha, ha! Well, this is wonderful. Really wonderful. But how old you've grown, Granddad."
The others asked him why he was so surprised, where he had seen Aksionov before. But Makar Semyonich did not reply. He only said,
It's wonderful that we should meet here, lads."
These words made Aksionov wonder whether this man knew who had killed the merchant, so he said, "Perhaps, Semyonich, you have heard of that affair, or maybe you've even seen me before."
How could I help hearing? The world is full of rumors, is it not? But it's a long time ago and I've forgotten what I heard.
Perhaps you heard who killed that merchant?" asked Aksionov. Makar Semyonich laughed.
"It must have been him in whose bag the knife was found. If someone else hid the knife there, he's not a thief till he's caught, as the saying goes. How could anyone put a knife into your bag while it was under your head? It would surely have woke you up, eh?"
When Aksionov heard these words, he felt sure that this was the man who had killed the merchant. He rose and went away. All that night, Aksionov lay awake. He felt terribly unhappy, and all sorts of images rose in his mind. There was the image of his wife as she was when he parted from her to go to the fair. He saw her as if she were present. Her face and her eyes rose before him. He heard her speak and laugh. Then Aksionov saw his children, quite little as they were at the time, one with a little cloak on, another at his mother's breast. And then he remembered himself as he used to be, young and merry. He remembered how he sat playing the guitar in the porch of the inn where he was arrested, and how free from care he had been. He saw in his mind the place where he was flogged, the executioner, the people standing around, the chains, the convicts, all the 26 years of his prison life and his premature old age. And he thought of it all, made him so wretched that he was ready to kill himself. That's all that villain's doing, thought Aksionov. His anger was so great against Makar Semyonich that he longed for vengeance, even if he himself should perish for it. He kept repeating all prayers all night, but he could get no peace. During the day, he did not go near Makar Semyonich, nor even look at him. A fortnight passed in this way. Aksionov could not sleep at night and was so miserable he did not know what to do. One night, as he was walking about the prison, he noticed some earth that came rolling out from under one of the shelves on which the prisoners slept. He stopped to see what that pile of dirt and earth was. Suddenly, Makar Semyonich crept out from under the shelf, and he looked up at Aksionov with a frightened face. Aksionov tried to pass without looking at him, but Makar seized his hand and told him that he had dug a hole under the wall, getting rid of the earth by putting it into his high boots and emptying it out every day on the road when the prisoners were driven to work.
Just you keep quiet, old man. You shall get out too. If you blab, they'll flog the life out of me. But I'll kill you first. I'll kill you.
Aksionov trembled with anger as he looked at his enemy. He drew his hand away, saying, "I have no wish to escape. You have no need to kill me. You killed me long ago. As to telling of you, I may do so or not, as God shall direct me." Next day, when the convicts were led out to work, the convoy soldiers noticed that one or the other of the prisoners emptied some earth out of his boots. The prisoner was searched, and the tunnel was found. The governor came and questioned all the prisoners to find out who had dug the hole. They all denied any knowledge of it. Those who knew would not betray Makar Semyonich, knowing he would be flogged almost to death. At last the governor turned to Aksionov, whom he knew to be a just man, and said, "You are a truthful old man. Tell me before God, who dug that hole?" Makar Semyonich stood as if he were quite unconcerned, looking at the governor and not so much as glancing at Aksionov. Aksyonov's lips and hands trembled, and for a long time he could not utter a word. He thought, "Why should I screen him who ruined my life? Let him pay for what I have suffered. But if I tell, they'll probably flog the life out of him. Maybe I suspect him wrongly. And after all, what good would it be to me now?" "Well, old man," repeated the governor, "tell me the truth. Who has been digging under the wall? Speak, old man." Aksionov glanced at Makar Semyonich and said, I cannot say, your honor. It is not God's will that I should tell. Do what you like with me. I am your hands. Oh, however much the governor tried, Aksionov would say no more, and so the matter had to be left. That night, when Aksionov was lying on his bed and just beginning to doze, someone came quietly and sat down on his bed. He peered through the darkness and recognized Makar. "What more do you want of me?" asked Aksionov.
Why? Why have you come here?
Makar Semyonik was silent, so Aksionov sat up and said,
What do you want? Go away or I'll call the guard.
Makar Semyonik bent close to Aksionov and whispered,
Ivan Dmitrik, forgive me.
"What for?" asked Aksionov.
It was I who killed that merchant and hid the knife among your things. I meant to kill you too, but I heard a noise outside, so I hid the knife in your bag and I escaped out of the window. I escaped.
Aksionov was silent, did not know what to say. Makar Semyonik slid off the bed shelf and knelt upon the ground.
Ivan Dmitrik, forgive me. For the love of God, Ivan, forgive me. I will confess that it was I who killed the merchant. You will be released. You can go to your home.
It is easy for you to talk, said Aksionov. But I have suffered for you these 26 years. Where can I go to now? My wife is dead. My children have forgotten me. I have nowhere to go. Makar Semyonik did not rise, but beat his head on the floor.
Ivan Dmitrik, forgive me. When they flogged me with the knot, it was not so hard to bear as it is to see you now. Yet you had pity on me, and you did not tell. Forgive me, wretch that I am.
And he began to sob. When Aksionov heard him sobbing, he too began to weep.
God will forgive you. Maybe I am 100 times worse than you. 100 times worse.
And at these words, his heart grew light, and the longing for home left him. He no longer had any desire to leave the prison, but only hoped for his last hour to come. In spite of what Aksionov had said, Makar Semyonik confessed his guilt. But when the order for his release came, Aksionov was already dead. So that's a little vignette that actually appears very similar in War and Peace, which I'm sure all of us have read at some point or another. You know, that big 9,000-page book. Okay, our final story is Tobermory, is by H. Munro, a.k.a. Saki. In this tale, in which the divine ferret acts out the boy's fantasy of revenge, Saki gives animals uncanny power. They act to expose the worst in their human counterparts. The human's response is instant and malicious. Their decision is described as if the guests were plotting the murder of a human. Because Saki's fiction always succeeds in bringing forth the worst in people, be it greed, or tyranny, or selfishness, Saki has himself been accused of inhumanity. A more intent look at the reasons for his deep sarcasm cannot fail to establish that the cruelty of Saki's stories is really the cruelty of the well-to-do society around him. The greed and vice of which stir his disgust and in turn impel him to put much of what he sees and feels on paper in ironic form, adding a dash of the exotic and supernatural to his often murderous fiction. There is no outlet for demonstrating your feelings towards people whom you simply loathe. That is really the crying need of our modern civilization. In a society where a faux pas could literally annihilate a person's social position, leaving him a choice of only internal or external exile, a man such as Munro, Saki, must have felt some of the shady morality, the hypocrisy, bigotry behind the facades of the respectability. Yet Saki's wit is so fine, his irony so subtle, he always remains the gentleman in his fiction. He triumphs by giving his readers an exquisitely crafted inside view of members of a different social class. So that's what Saki's about, what this story is kind of, well, pretty much all of Saki's stories are similar to this one. Which is why this is a classic example, and here we go. Tobermory. It was a chill, rain-washed afternoon of a late August day, that indefinite season when the partridges are still in security or cold storage. There's nothing to hunt, unless one is bounded on the north by the Bristol Channel, in which case one may lawfully gallop after fat red stags. Lady Blemley's house party was not bounded on the north by the Bristol Channel, hence there was a full gathering of her guests round the tea table on this particular afternoon. And in spite of the blankness of the season and the triteness of the occasion, there was no trace in the company of that fatigued restlessness, which means a dread of the pianola and a subdued hankering for the auction bridge. The undisguised open-mouthed attention of the entire house party was fixed on the homely negative personality of Mr. Cornelius Appin. Of all her guests, he was the one who had come to Lady Blemley with the vaguest reputation. Someone had said he was clever, that he had got his invitation in a moderate expectation on part of his hostess, that some portion of at least his cleverness would be contributed to the general entertainment. Until tea time that day, she had been unable to discover in what direction, if any, his cleverness lay. He was neither a wit nor a croquet champion. He was not a hypnotic force, nor a begetter of amateur theatricals. Neither did his exterior suggest the sort of man in whom women are willing to pardon a generous measure of mental deficiency. He had subsided into mere Mr. Appin, and the Cornelius seemed a piece of transparent baptismal bluff. And I was claiming to have launched on the world a discovery besides which the invention of gunpowder, of the printing press, of steam locomotion were inconsiderable trifles of inventions at all. Science had made bewildering strides in many directions during recent decades. But this thing that Mr. Appin had seemed to belong to the domain of miracle rather than scientific achievement. "And do you really ask us to believe, old man," Sir Wilfrid was saying, "that you have discovered a means for instructing animals, animals, and the art of human speech, and that dear old Tobermory has proved your first successful pupil?" "It is a problem at which I have worked for the last 17 years, said Mr. Appin. "But only during the last 8 or 9 months have I been rewarded with the glimmerings of success. Of course, I have experimented with thousands of animals, but latterly only with cats. Cats! Those wonderful creatures which have assimilated themselves so marvelously with our civilization while retaining all their highly developed feral instincts. Here and there among cats one comes across an outstanding, superior intellect, just as one does among the ruck of human beings. And when I made the acquaintance of Tobermory a week ago, I saw at once that I was in contact with a beyond cat of extraordinary intelligence. I had gone far along the road to success in recent experiments. With Tobermory, as you call him, I have reached this goal." Mr. Appin concluded his remarkable statement in a voice which strove to divest of a triumphant inflection. No one said rats, though Clovis's lips moved in a monosyllabic contortion which probably invoked those rodents of disbelief. "And do you mean to say," asked Miss Resker after a slight pause, "that you have taught Tobermory, what is his name? Tobermory, the cat, to say and understand easy sentences of one syllable?" "Oh, my dear Miss Resker," said the wonder-worker impatiently, "one will teach little children and savages, backward adults, in that piecemeal fashion when one has once solved the problem of beginning with an animal of highly developed intelligence. One has no need for those halting methods. Tobermory can speak our language with perfect correctness." This time Clovis very distinctly said, "Beyond rats." Sir Wilfrid was more polite, but equally skeptical. "Well, hadn't we better have the cat in and judge for ourselves, then?" suggested Lady Blemley. Sir Wilfrid went in search of the animal. The company settled themselves down to the languid expectation of witnessing some more or less adroit drawing-room ventriloquism. In a minute Sir Wilfrid was back in the room, his face white beneath its tan, and his eyes dilated with excitement. "By God, people, it's true!" His agitation was unmistakably genuine. His hearers started forward in a thrill of awakened interest. Collapsing into an armchair, he continued breathlessly, I found him dozing in the smoking room and called out to him to come for tea. He blinked at me in his usual way, and he said, God help me, he said, 'Come on, Toby, don't keep us waiting.' And by God, he drawled out in the most horribly natural voice that he'd come when he dashed well pleased.
I nearly jumped out of my skin.
Appin had preached to absolutely incredulous hearers. Sir Wilfrid's statement carried instant conviction. A babble-like chorus of startled exclamation arose, amid which the scientist sat mutely enjoying the first fruit of his stupendous discovery. In the midst of the clamor, Tobermory entered the room and made his way with velvet tread and studied unconcern across to the group seated around the table. A sudden hush of awkwardness, constraint, fell on the company. Somehow there seemed an element of embarrassment in addressing on equal terms a domestic cat of acknowledged mental ability.
Will you have some milk, Tobermory?
Asked Lady Blemley in a rather strained voice. I don't mind if I do, was the response, couched in a tone of even indifference. A shiver of suppressed excitement went through the listeners, and Lady Blemley might be excused for pouring out the saucer full of milk rather unsteadily.
I'm afraid I've spilt a good deal of it, she said apologetically.
After all, it's not my Axminster, was Tobermory's rejoinder. An Axminster being a rug or a carpet on the floor, you know. Another silence fell on the group, and then Miss Resker, in her best district visitor manner, asked if the human language had been difficult to learn. Tobermory looked squarely at her for a moment, and then fixed his gaze serenely in the middle distance. It was obvious that boring questions lay outside his scheme of life.
What do you think of human intelligence, then?
Asked Mavis Pellington lamely. Of whose intelligence, in particular? Asked Tobermory coldly.
Oh, well, mine, for instance, said Mavis.
Yes, you put me in a rather embarrassing position, said Tobermory, whose tone and attitude certainly did not suggest a shred of embarrassment. When your inclusion in this house party was suggested, Sir Wilfrid protested that you were the most brainless woman of his acquaintance, and that there was a wide distinction between hospitality and the care of the feeble-minded. Lady Blemley replied that your lack of brain power was the precise quality which had earned you your invitation, as you were the only person she could think of who might be idiotic enough to buy their old car. You know, the one they call the envy of Sisyphus, because it goes quite nicely uphill if you push it. Lady Blemley's protestations would have had a greater effect if she had not casually suggested to Mavis only that morning that the car in question would be just the thing for her down at the Devonshire home. Major Barfield plunged in heavily to effect a diversion. How about your carryings on with that tortoiseshell puss up at the stables, eh, Tobermory? The moment he had said it, everyone realized the blunder. Oh, well, one does not usually discuss these matters in public, said Tobermory frigidly. From a slight observation of your ways since you've been in this house, I should imagine you'd find it inconvenient if I were to shift the conversation on to your own little affairs, Major Barfield. The panic which ensued was not confined to the Major.
Would you like to go see if your cook has got your dinner ready?
Suggested Lady Blemley hurriedly, affecting to ignore the fact that it wanted at least 2 hours to Tobermory's dinner time. Yes, thanks, said Tobermory. Not quite so soon after my tea. I don't want to die of indigestion, you see. Cats have 9 lives, you know, said Wilfrid heartily. Yes, possibly so, answered Tobermory. But only 1 liver, you see.
Adelaide, said Mrs. Cornet, do you mean to encourage that cat to go out and gossip about us in the servants' hall?
The panic had indeed become general. A narrow ornamental balustrade ran in front of the most of the bedroom windows at the towers, and it was recalled with dismay that this had formed a favorite promenade for Tobermory at all hours, whence he could watch the pigeons. Yes, watch the pigeons, and heaven knew what else besides. If he intended to become reminiscent in his present outspoken strain, the effect would be something more than disconcerting. Mrs. Cornet, who spent much time at her toilet table and whose complexion was reputed to be of a nomadic though punctual disposition, looked as ill at ease as the Major. Miss Scrawwen, who wrote fiercely sensuous poetry and led a blameless life, merely displayed irritation. If you are methodical and virtuous in private, you don't necessarily want everyone to know it. Bertie Van Ton, who was so depraved at 17 that he had long ago given up trying to be any worse, turned a dull shade of gardenia white, but he did not commit the error of dashing out of the room like Odo Finsbury, a young gentleman who was understood to be reading for the church and who was possibly disturbed at the thought of scandals he might hear concerning other people. Clovis had the presence of mind to maintain a composed exterior. Privately, he was calculating how long it would take to procure a box of fancy mice through the agency of the Exchange in Mart as a species of hush money for Tobermory, as it were. Even in a delicate situation like the present, Agnes Resker could not endure to remain too long in the background.
"Oh, why did I ever come down here?" she asked dramatically.
Tobermory immediately accepted the opening. Judging by what you said to Mrs. Cornet on the croquet lawn yesterday, you were out for food. You described the Blemleys as the dullest people to stay with that you ever knew, that you said they were clever enough to employ a first-rate cook. Otherwise, they'd find it difficult to get anyone to come down a second time. Yes, I believe that is what you said, Agnes, is it not?
There's not a word of truth in that. I appeal to Mrs. Cornet," exclaimed the discomfited Agnes.
Mrs. Cornet repeated your remark afterwards to Bertie Van Ton, continued Tobermory, and said that woman is a regular hunger marcher. She'd go anywhere for 4 square meals a day. And Bertie Van Ton said... At this point, the chronicle mercifully ceased. Tobermory had caught a glimpse of the big yellow Tom from the rectory working his way through the shrubbery towards the stable wing. In a flash, Tobermory had vanished through the open French window. With the disappearance of his too brilliant pupil, Cornelius Appin, remember Cornelius Appin, the mad scientist who made Tobermory speak in the first place? Yes. Cornelius Appin found himself beset by a hurricane of bitter upbraiding, anxious inquiry, and frightened entreaty. The responsibility for the situation lay with him, and he must prevent matters from becoming worse. Could Tobermory impart his dangerous gift to other cats, was the first question he had to answer. It was possible, yes, he replied, that he might have initiated his intimate friend, the stable puss, into his new accomplishment, but it was unlikely that his teaching could have taken a wider range as yet.
"Why then," said Mrs. Cornet, "Tobermory may be a valuable cat and a great pet, but I'm sure you'll agree, Adelaide, that both he and the stable cat must be done away with without delay."
You don't suppose I've enjoyed the last quarter of hour, do you?" said Lady Blemley bitterly.
"My husband and I are very fond of Tobermory. At least we were before this horrible accomplishment was infused into him. But if now, of course, the only thing is to have him destroyed as soon as possible."
Yes, we can put some strychnine in the scraps he always gets at dinner time," said Sir Wilfrid. "I will go down and I will drain this. I will drown the stable puss myself. The coachman will be very sore at losing his pet, but I'll say a very catching form of mange has broken out. Both cats were afraid of it spreading to the kennels."
But my great discovery," expostulated Mr. Appin. "After all my years of research and experiments..."
"You can go and experiment on the shorthorns of the farm who are under proper control," said Mrs. Cornet.
"Or the elephants at the zoological gardens." "Yes, the elephants. They're said to be highly intelligent. And they have this recommendation: they don't come creeping about our bedrooms and under our chairs and so forth."
An archangel ecstatically proclaiming the millennium, and then finding that it clashed unpardonably with Henley and would have to be indefinitely postponed, could hardly have felt more crestfallen than our Cornelius Appin at the reception of his wonderful achievement. Public opinion, however, was against him. In fact, had the general voice been consulted on the subject, it is probable that a strong minority vote would have been in favor of including him in the strychnine diet. Effective train arrangements and a nervous desire to see that matters brought to a finish prevented an immediate dispersal of the party. But dinner that evening was not a social success. Sir Wilfrid had had a rather trying time with the stable puss, and subsequently with the coachman. Agnes Resker ostentatiously limited her repast to a morsel of dry toast, which she bit as though it were a personal enemy. While Mavis Pellington maintained a vindictive silence throughout the meal, Lady Blemley kept up a flow of what she hoped was conversation, but her attention was fixed on the doorway. A plate full of carefully dosed fish scraps, dosed with strychnine, was in readiness on the sideboard, but sweets and savory and dessert went their way, and no Tobermory appeared either in the dining room or the kitchen. The sepulchral dinner was cheerful compared with the subsequent vigil in the smoking room. Eating and drinking had at least supplied a distraction and cloaked the prevailing embarrassment. Bridge was out of the question in the general tension of nerves and tempers, and after Odo Finsbury had given a lugubrious rendering of Melisande in the Wood to a frigid audience, music was tacitly avoided. At 11, the servants went to bed, announcing that the small window in the pantry had been left open as usual for Tobermory's private use. The guests read steadily through the current batch of magazines and fell back gradually on the badminton library and bound volumes of Punch. Lady Blemley made periodic visits to the pantry, returning each time with an expression of listless depression which forestalled questioning. At 2 o'clock, Clovis broke the dominating silence. Yes, he won't turn up tonight. He's probably in the local newspaper office at the present moment, dictating the first installment of his reminiscences to some local reporter. Lady What's-Her-Name's book won't be in it. It'll be the event of the day. Having made this contribution to the general cheerfulness, Clovis went to bed. At long intervals, the various members of the house party followed his example. The servants taking around the early tea made a uniform announcement in reply to a uniform question, as Tobermory had not returned. Breakfast was, if anything, a more unpleasant function than dinner had been, but before its conclusion the situation was relieved. Tobermory's corpse was brought in from the shrubbery, or a gardener had just discovered it. From the bites on his throat and the yellow fur which coated his claws, it was evident that he had fallen in unequal combat with the big tomcat from the rectory. By midday, most of the guests had quitted the towers, and after lunch, Lady Blemley had sufficiently recovered her spirits to write an extremely nasty letter to the rectory about the loss of her valuable pet. Tobermory had been Appin's one successful pupil, and he was destined to have no successor. A few weeks later, an elephant in the Dresden Zoological Garden, which had shown no previous signs of irritability, broke loose and killed an Englishman who had apparently been teasing it. The victim's name was variously reported in the papers as Open and Eppelin, but his front name was faithfully rendered Cornelius.
Well, if he was trying German irregular verbs on the poor beast, said Clovis, he deserved all that he got.
And so, I hope you have enjoyed tonight's little foray into some classic literature from Ernest Hemingway, Leo Tolstoy, and H. Munro, a.k.a. Saki. Thank you for joining us.